Hello, everyone, and welcome to another one of our Lunch and Learn programs. My name is Lauren. I'm an education specialist at the Charlotte Museum of History, and I am so delighted today to learn more about food history. So if you've been following along on any of our social media channels over the last year, you are very aware that I absolutely love the history of food. I love the conversations it starts about who we are, conversations it starts about ideas and national, about the traditions, about the stories, and about the ability to bring forth untold voices, to be able to learn more about the people that made this area home, and the people that continue to come here today. And so I am actually delighted to welcome one of my former professors. Remember, she has no control over my grade anymore, but I absolutely love the the research that she's been doing into food history and across an article she wrote. It was an article called Don't Eat Bat Fried Rice, which is a very provocative title. And I read the article, and what really stood out to me was this idea of family and the stories that we tell and the stories that food helps us tell. And so I actually asked her to join us today, and she was gracious enough to agree. And so I am delighted to get to introduce Dr. Michelle King. So Dr. King is an associate professor of history at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, specializes in Chinese gender history and food history. She's been 2020 to 2021 National Endowment for the Humanities Public Scholars Grant for her book project on Taiwan's beloved post-war television cooking celebrity. She recently edited Culinary Nationalism in Asia, a collection of comparative studies of culinary nationalism in East, Southeast, and South Asia, and a special issue of Global Food History on culinary regionalism in China. So, Dr. King, I am so excited you're here today with us.
Thank you, Lauren, and it's a real pleasure to be here with all of you and speak to this audience for the Charlotte Museum of History, which is great to see the public history outreach that your institution is doing. So I'm going to share my screen now. And all right, so is that all okay? Give me a thumbs up, Lauren, if that looks okay to you. Okay, great.
You're good.
Um, So I'm going to spend my time today talking a little bit about just a really brief history of Chinese American restaurants in the United States. I'm also going to talk about migration patterns, and I'm also going to be talking about sort of the recent um, anti-Asian, I don't know, incidents that have happened and their relationship to Chinese food. So I'm going to begin though by asking all of you a poll question. So Lauren or Angel, if you can share the poll with everyone. So the first question is, have you ordered from a Chinese restaurant since the start of the pandemic? You can just mark yes or no. And if you have ordered from a Chinese restaurant since the start of the pandemic, how many times have you done so? So we'll give a few moments for everyone to answer. All right. Is there, Lauren, can you reveal the results? Okay, yes, wonderful. Everyone in our audience today has actually already ordered from a Chinese restaurant since the start of the pandemic. Many of you have ordered many, many times from a Chinese restaurant over the past year, and about a quarter, it looks like, have ordered one or two times, and about a third, 3 to 5 times. That's great. So that gives us some context for thinking about today's discussion. Um, so I like to start today's talk by showing you this slide. This was a page from a 1880 census given to me by a colleague. And she gave it to me because of the remarkable note. As you can see, North Carolina in this particular survey, this 1880 census, had one quote unquote Asiatic in 1880. It's amazing that this person even registered on the census at all. But I just think that's a really interesting concept to think about, or starting place. 1881 Asiatic, and I can't tell you anything more about who this person was or what nationality they actually were, even. at the time. If you compare that now with this slide, which is the percentage of Chinese population by US state, the top map is actually from 1870, and the bottom map is from the most recent census in 2010. And as you can see, kind of the high concentration of Chinese living in the United States in the latter part of the 19th century has basically been spread out across the United States. So now there's sort of a more even distribution of Chinese all over the US, um, ranging, the percentage of the population ranges a little bit. But here in North Carolina, and this data is from North Carolina Asian Americans Together, what's really interesting is that Asian Americans as a group have grown tremendously in North Carolina from 2000 to 2010. The population, Asian American population in North Carolina grew by 85%, which was really the third fastest rate of growth of Asian Americans of any state in the country, which is really quite remarkable. There are over 300,000 Asian Americans living in North Carolina today. That's about 3% of North Carolina's population, and obviously growing. Mecklenburg County, where Charlotte is, has about 61,000 Asian American residents. I don't have any specific data on Chinese American population specifically, but the breakdown of Asian American population in North Carolina is actually one quarter Indian or South Asian, and then 15% Chinese, 12% Vietnamese, and 12% Filipino. And then all the other Asian nationalities would be some percentage less than that. So I just thought that was interesting to give you guys a sense of how Chinese have, you know, sort of been part of this state for quite a number of years. So one of the things that, is interesting to think about when thinking about Chinese restaurants and people who work in them is that if I had forgotten to ask in the poll question, how many of you have eaten at a Chinese restaurant? Everyone of you has eaten at a Chinese restaurant in the last year, or gotten takeout or something. But if I were to ask you, do you know where the people who work in that restaurant come from? That would be an interesting question to ask, and I haven't got a poll question for that. But if you know which part of the world they come from, kudos to you. Most people probably don't or would guess probably China. But what I want to talk about today is the variety and the range of different places that people who own and have been involved in the Chinese restaurant industry in the United States have come from, because it has varied quite dramatically. Um, and I really want to present to you a sense of the people behind the plate, the people behind the food served in Chinese restaurants in this country, as Lauren was suggesting earlier. In the early part or the latter half of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century, almost all Chinese migrants, a very huge percentage of them, came from one province. And more specifically, a huge percentage of those migrants came from one county in Guangdong province, which is an amazing statistic, right? So most of those people came from the south of China. They spoke Cantonese, and popular dishes that became popular amongst American audiences, such as chop suey, were sort of bastardized forms of a very localized Cantonese dishes, which is just a random thing stir fried together with a gravy. But what I want to share with you is the sense that the waves of Chinese migrants that have come to the States has dramatically changed over the course of the past century. Um, so from the late 19th and early 20th century, most of the migrants came from Guangdong or Canton. So if you went into a Chinese restaurant 100 years ago, most likely those people would speak Cantonese, not Mandarin, which is what they speak in Beijing and throughout most of China as a standard national dialect, but Cantonese, which is what people from Hong Kong speak and people from Guangdong province. Now that changes and shifts quite dramatically in the post-war period, from the 1960s onward, as we have almost all the migrants coming from Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Singapore, places outside of mainland China proper. Now, why did this shift happen? Because when the People's Republic of China was established in 1949, very quickly the country sort of closed itself to outward migration. So people in China weren't really leaving China in the post-war period during the Maoist period. However, on the contrary, In the United States, there was a reform of the Immigration and Naturalization Act in 1965, which basically opened up migration to the United States from many, many more places around the world besides Europe, including Asia, including Africa, including the Americas. And so the migration, Chinese migration that happened to the United States in the 1960s and 70s, and even through the 1980s, largely came from Taiwan, Hong Kong, or Singapore. So at that point, if you had gone to a Chinese restaurant in the 1980s, for example, or the 1970s, probably the proprietors would be from Hong Kong or Taiwan or Singapore, right? One of those places, sometimes Malaysia even, but they would not have come from mainland China, right? There would be some legacy owners of older Chinese restaurants who were Cantonese who had migrated here in the earlier part of the 20th century, but really the new Chinese migrants of the 60s and 70s were from these non-mainland Chinese places. Now that changes again when we get to the late 1980s, when with economic reforms in mainland China, China once again opens itself up and people are allowed to migrate out of China. And what we see from the 1980s, 1990s onward is a tremendous shift in the people involved in the Chinese restaurant industry in the United States. And from that point on, most of the people, or many, many, many of the people who own Chinese restaurants and work in Chinese restaurants, come from the single province of Fujian. Again, this isn't true of everyone, but it's true of a lot of different Chinese restaurateurs. Um, and so, dollars to donuts, if the next time you go to your Chinese takeout place, ask the people who work there what part of China or what part of the world they come from. They might not come from China at all. They may come from Malaysia. They may come from India. They may come from, Singapore or Taiwan. So it's just a really interesting exercise in world geography to learn a little bit more about where, and if they come from China, where in China do they come from? To learn more about the people that are serving you the food or making the food for you. Um, so, as a kind of an example of this pattern, I wanted to show this slide. This is a website for my class portfolio. I teach a class at UNC on Chinese food history, the cultural history of Chinese food. And one of the projects that I have my students do is I have them interview a Chinese restaurateur in North Carolina. And it's a fantastic project. The students go all out and they've done these fantastic kind of in-depth profiles of the people who bring Chinese food to your plate, basically. And I wanted to point out some of the ones in the Charlotte area that people have, some of my students have profiled. Last spring, my student interviewed John Yu from The Taste of Sue in Charlotte, and it's a fairly recent restaurant, but it really specializes in Sichuanese cuisine. Shu is a kind of a historical name for the area of Sichuan. And interestingly enough, though, John himself is Fujianese, so he's from a totally different province. But Sichuanese food is really popular in the United States. A lot of Americans recognize Sichuanese food and know it's spicy. They probably don't know anything about Fujianese food, so it's very rare that you would see a Fujianese restaurant, even though many of the people running them are from the province of Fujian. Other students profiled the owner of Cottage Express, a takeout place in Charlotte, and Zhu Yuan there. He's also a Fujianese migrant. And um, another student interviewed the owner of Soho Bistro, who is from Guangdong province, again, showing that very regionalized origins of many of the Chinese restaurant owners in the United States. And Yen Lin is, Cantonese, and she says that the restaurant is sort of Cantonese in inspiration. So um, I don't know the restaurants myself. I've not been to Charlotte in a while, especially not recently. But I just thought it would be interesting for all of you who live in Charlotte to know where some of the Chinese restaurateurs in your local city have come from. And again, I encourage you to strike up a conversation the next time you go to your favorite Chinese restaurant and just ask them what part of China are you from, or what part of the world are you from, because it might not be what you expect. And that's one of the things that the students, in this class portfolio, one of the really deeply powerful things for me as an instructor is to see the range of experiences that Chinese migrants to this state have. They don't all come from China. They have a wide variety of interests, and they kind of the one thing that links, and like this other picture below, Rasa Indie Chinese restaurant, the man is a third generation Indian Chinese. So his grandfather first went to India, and then eventually he and his wife, who is Indian, emigrated to the United States and opened this restaurant in Chapel Hill, which serves their own kind of Indianized Chinese food. So every place in the world, their local Chinese cuisine is catering to their local tastes, just like Chinese American food is kind of catering to American palates. The same is true of Chinese food everywhere around the world, and it's just a really interesting phenomenon, and you just really can learn a lot about the wide range of Chinese migrants when you talk about restaurants. So, unfortunately, given the pandemic and given the recent kind of awful news, continual news, I just read another story about some elderly Asian women who were attacked in San Francisco. Because of this onslaught of news, one of the things that I have tried to do during this pandemic year is to do a lot of public outreach like this talk, and to really dispel some of the myths about Chinese food that have unfortunately arisen because of the pandemic. And I will direct you to this panel that I did last May with some other scholars of Chinese food history, and it was called Rumors. What was it called? Rumor Chinese Diets and COVID-19 Questions and Answers about Chinese Food and Eating Habits. And if you're really curious to know more about the origins of the coronavirus, or what people have learned, and the connection to the seafood market in Wuhan, where for a long time at the beginning was called the epicenter of the coronavirus, which, by the way, has not been studied or proven yet by scientists. They don't know what the origin is actually of the virus. I direct you to this particular video recording of the panel that we did at that time. Answers can answer a lot more of your questions that you might have about that. But unfortunately, with the use of terms by our former president, such as Kung flu and Chinese virus, there's obviously been a huge uptick in anti Chinese and anti Asian crimes, and also just prejudice and misinformation that's running around. And this is just an example. This shirt was designed by a t-shirt designer in California, and it was posted by the Lululemon, that's an athletic leisure wear company, art director. It's just this bat, this Chinese takeout box which says "No thank you" with bat wings on it, kind of alluding to the idea that people were eating bat fried rice, and that's where this coronavirus came from. The art director was subsequently fired after posting that. But the T-shirt, you can still buy it anywhere online that you want, which is also really unfortunate. And so it's a really interesting, what was really interesting for me to be teaching last spring when the coronavirus lockdowns were starting, is that the last time I met with my students in person in my Chinese food class, they were telling me about all the racist memes that they were seeing circulating on their social media and on the internet. And it was saddening to me to hear from them that their friends were afraid of eating Chinese food. One girl told me that she knew an acquaintance who ordered Chinese food and then refused to accept the delivery, and just all manner of, like, as one young woman in a New York Times documentary said, the coronavirus was raging in Italy at the same time as well, but nobody was shutting down or boycotting Olive Garden or saying racist stuff about Italians. So, there's obviously a lot of racial things in there. Interestingly, so last spring in April, this credit card company, Womply, reported that Chinese restaurants had closed at a much higher rate compared to other kinds of takeout restaurants. 51% of Chinese restaurants had closed. At a high point, it was something more like 60%, versus 19% of takeout places overall. And so people thought, oh, this is a sign that people are not eating Chinese food. A lot of these restaurants are closing. What is really interesting, by the following month, however, more and more Chinese restaurants had reopened, according to the credit card data from this credit card company. And their open rate was more like 74%, which was a much closer match for US restaurants as a whole. So that's an indicator that people were closing Chinese restaurants temporarily, and a lot of people were thinking that it was because maybe some of these family-run restaurants, they had older people, grandmothers or grandfathers at home. They didn't want to risk their older family members getting sick. So maybe that's why a lot more Chinese restaurants closed at the beginning versus now. However, like every other restaurant in the country, people are really facing challenges in the restaurant industry. And there's no question that Chinese restaurants have closed at a very high rate. And I wanted to show you also this information. This is Grace Young. Some of you may know her if you have any Chinese cookbooks. She's a very well-known cookbook author. She wrote Stir Frying to the Sky's Edge and a number of other really well-received and cookbooks that have won awards on Chinese cooking. And so she has kind of become the face of saving New York City's Chinatown. And she started with the James Beard Foundation, this Save Chinese Restaurants hashtag, which encourages people to take a picture of the food from their favorite Chinese restaurant and post it to Instagram or uh, I guess I don't know if it's Twitter or Instagram, but anyway, that's the hashtag Save Chinese Restaurants. She also has collaborated with some documentary filmmakers to make documentaries about the impact of coronavirus on New York City's Chinatown and on the different restaurateurs in the area. So that's under this coronavirus Chinatown stories. If you Google that, you'll be able to find and learn more about some of these restaurants in New York City that have a super long history. They've been there for decades, and some of them are actually threatened by imminent closure because they simply don't have the customers and foot traffic that they once did. So she's also started this Support Chinatown Fund, which supports food distribution to seniors who are living in New York City Chinatown and have had difficulties going out or are afraid to go out. So they've been doing food distributions to seniors living there. Similar kinds of um, um, similar kinds of programs are being run in other major Chinatowns like San Francisco and Oakland. So people are really trying to help the restaurants that they love, which are neighborhood places that are near and dear to their hearts. Another kind of this kind of hashtag is called Take Out Hate. And it's a similar kind of thing where it says Asian restaurants are facing discrimination and mass closures. Help them survive by ordering takeout today. So again, encouraging consumers to order takeout from their local Asian restaurants and then take a picture and post it to that particular hashtag as a way of encouraging their friends to eat and taking pictures of the delicious food that's available. So I did want to point out some of those ways that you yourself as a consumer can make some effort to support the businesses that you patronize and love. Okay, so another really interesting thing that has happened since the start of the pandemic with regard to Chinese American restaurants and Chinese American food is I love this effort by this chef owner of this fast casual chain in New York City. It's called Junzi. And Lucas Sin is like a wunderkind, young Asian American chef. He's from Hong Kong. He started cooking in his college dormitory, and people loved what he was making. And eventually, he started with his friends this basically, they're trying to make it like fast food, but it's Chinese food. And at the start of the pandemic, he came out with this distance dining concept. So these are meals in a bag that people could order in the New York area. And the first iteration was called Chinese Food is Good for You. And it had this wonderful, lion's head meatballs and chicken broth and yam and osmanthus, and kind of really fighting back the negative publicity that Chinese food and Chinese people had gotten by pushing back and saying, no, actually, this food is wonderful. This food is delicious. And wouldn't you like to have that for lunch? I know it's kind of dangerous coming to a lunch and learn if you haven't actually eaten yet. Um, I also wanted to show you the rest of the distance dining uh, collaborations that Lucasson has done with other chefs. Um, and it's really just amazing. This is their I guess, Lauren, you can tell me if you can't see this, but this is distance dining series, and you can see this Creole Chinese collaboration with the Creole chef, Indian Chinese, again, Indianized versions of Chinese food, West African Chinese, Cantonese and Taiwanese. They did a collaboration with Korean on Korean food, another one with Vietnamese food, Malaysian Chinese, and New Chinese American, and then here Chinese Thai, Chinese Japanese, and Chinese Puerto Rican, and then here's Chinese Filipino. So it's just a really wonderful way of talking about and sharing with consumers all the different places in the world that Chinese people have migrated to and made their local fusion cuisines, like with all in all of these different places. And it looks absolutely delicious to me. And I, often wish I lived in New York so that I could eat at all of these places. But that's another thing that I wanted to share with all of you. Um, and finally, the last slide that I wanted to share with all of you is this one. This is a picture that a student of mine used in one of her kind of online presentations about a Chinese cookbook that she was writing about. That's another assignment I give all of my students to do, an analysis of a Chinese cookbook. And I love this picture. It's from a 2007 Lunar New Year celebration in Beijing. And although I don't know any of these people personally, I feel like I know this feeling and this celebration of food, because this is what Chinese food means to me. As a second generation Chinese American, I always associate food with family and with celebrating and with gathering with people you love. And you look at all those delicious things on the table, they're about to tuck into some really tasty food. But this picture to me was the meme that I want to share with the world. This picture to me talks about what Chinese food means for so many people. It's not about bat fried rice, it's not about these racist memes. I want to push back against those ideas of Chinese food being dangerous or Chinese people somehow, harboring the coronavirus more than anyone else. With a picture like this, a picture about family, a picture about food, a picture about coming together and celebrating. And I want to encourage all of you to think about the people behind the plate. The next time you order Chinese food from a Chinese restaurant, it's not just the food on the table that we look at in this picture, but it's everyone that's partaking in that, everyone that's had a hand in making that food. And so that's kind of the message that I want to share with everyone today. Um, thank you very much.
Well, thank you for sharing so much of your own story with us, as well as so much about kind of the world that we're living in right now. And I know here in Charlotte, one of the things that we at the museum really loved watching was the community coming together to support our Charlotte restaurants during the last year. I know everyone at the museum, all of our employees, we've all ordered from different restaurants. We've all watched the lines around the door or around the block for some of these restaurants, that people realize just how important these spaces are. And these spaces for conversation. And I know you've talked a little bit about this, but I think there's this sort of impetus to overgeneralize when it comes to food types. So there's the generic Italian food or Hispanic food, and it kind of loses some of those nuances. So I know you've talked a little bit about these regional differences, but would you mind telling us a little bit more about those hallmarks?
Sure. Let me share this slide with you. Let's see if I can find it. Um, so yeah, some people say, if you go on the internet, people who are real foodies or whatever will frequently say there's no such thing as Chinese food. Every kind of food in China is so regionalized and it's so distinct and different. Frequently, people who know much about Chinese food will talk about the quote unquote 8 major regional cuisines, which I've circled here on this map. And those are just 8 very well known um, regional cuisines that sometimes people in the United States have heard of, like Sichuanese or Hunanese food or Cantonese food, but sometimes they haven't heard of, like Zhejiang food or Jiangsu food or Fujianese food or Shandong food. Um, Actually, more and more places are hearing about northern Chinese cuisine with like noodles and buns, and there's just ever since the 1960s, when more people from China came to the United States, and Americans grew more aware of regional distinctions in Chinese food, there's been ever more awareness on the part of Americans of different kinds of regional Chinese cuisine. So, they eat buns and noodles in the north and rice in the south. The food is spicy in Sichuan and Hunan. The food is quite delicate and sweet, maybe Cantonese food, or a lot of seafood and lighter, sweeter tastes in Jiangsu and Zhejiang, which you can see are on the coast. So, you could spend your lifetime eating Chinese food and never eat your way to the end of the table. Like, there's just so much of it, and it's so different. So I often say, if anyone says, I don't like Chinese food, I'm thinking, how on earth is that possible? Because I bet you I can find you something you will love to eat because there's so much of it. It's all so different. And there's so many tastes represented even amongst these foods that, I would be flabbergasted if anyone could say that they couldn't find anything they liked that came from Chinese cuisine. I also want to point out to you with this map that there's a lot of things that we don't think of when we think of Chinese food, and it's an open question whether it should be considered as Chinese food. For example, there's a number of places now in bigger urban areas that serve Uyghur food or Xinjiang food. This is Turkic Muslims who live in the northwest part of China. And obviously, there's also a lot of political, kind of complications happening right now with Xinjiang. But most Americans wouldn't think of Xinjiang food as Chinese food or Tibetan food as Chinese food, and that's fine. Like that's the interesting thing about China. It's just so diverse in terms of its geography, in terms of its ethnicities, and in terms of its food. It just makes it a really interesting place to study. So you could spend a lifetime learning Chinese about Chinese food and you'd never eat it all. That's the great thing about it. Yeah.
And I think one of the things that when it comes to talking about food, it's the changes that happen as people move from place to place. It's as people interact with others. We know, especially in Charlotte, in early Charlotte, we really see the development of food change as more people end up in this region. You see the mixing of a number of different traditions that all come together to create something uniquely Southern. It's West African, it's Catawba, it's European based, it's all of these different things that come together. And one of the things, especially we see here in the United States, is there are so many people coming here and so many people that are interacting and creating these new, really cool dishes. But what is kind of the main difference between Chinese food from China? I mean, obviously, there's a lot that goes into that, a lot of different styles and that we've just covered here. But what do you see as kind of the main differences between food from China itself versus food that we see in the United States?
Well, it's interesting because, a lot of my students, they come in and when they come into my food history class, they all have a bee in their bonnet about authentic food. This place is authentic. This place is not authentic. Blah blah, which is basically how close is it to what my perception of what Chinese food based on maybe what they ate at home or maybe if they traveled to China or Taiwan and they once had before. But I really want people to get away from thinking about authenticity as kind of the be all end all measure of Chinese restaurants because frankly, when my students go out and talk to all the different Chinese restaurateurs that they talk to in North Carolina, what they discover is people have had to adapt in order to survive, right? They serve the food that people will eat. And as I mentioned before, in every place in the globe, Chinese migrants have gone there and adapted their cuisine to fit local tastes. That's just because that's what you do in order to survive. And so, for example, in France, they serve Chinese food in courses, and you have a soup course, and then you have your dish, and then you have your dessert, because that's the way a French person might be used to eating French food. So, it isn't served family style, or not always. It's often like a kind of what do they call, a prefix menu where you have specific things served to you. And so what you do once you think about that is like you can get away from the idea of is this authentic, is this not authentic. It's just, do you like it or don't you like it? Is it taste good to you or doesn't it taste good to you? I think there is definitely a distinction between the kinds of foods that people eat in China versus the kinds of Chinese Americanized foods that are served here in restaurants here. Often people say it's a lot sweeter, People don't have as a quote unquote adventurous palate, so you will only see the recognizable meats of beef, chicken, pork. You won't see other cuts. You won't see different parts like chicken feet or pig's trotters or something, which might be very, very popular. You won't see things with different textures and smells. Seafood, like one of my students interviewed a Chinese restaurateur who lives on the coast, and he said, I tried to offer seafood. I tried to bring in fresh seafood, and nobody would order it. Americans just won't eat fish that has bones in it. They won't. So a lot of times it's a slow change and in education of palates. So you see much more deep fried stuff here, thicker, heavier sauces. But again, in a lot of different places, people's palates are changing. They're ready to take on spicier foods. They're ready to tackle, kind of really local specialties, especially in a mecca like New York. There's all kinds of places that are specializing in Shandong noodles or Xi'an, xianbing or some like stuffed uh, kind of bun things, pancake things. Um, yeah, so there's just a lot of sorry for Lauren, I forgot your original question, but basically just to say that um yeah, don't think about food as authentic or inauthentic. Just think, do I like it or don't I like it? And it's okay for you to change your mind. It's okay for your palate to grow. And I encourage always people to try new things like I do with my kids. Always take a bite and see if you like it, because you might be surprised. And the beauty of Chinese food is that it can encompass this range. It's so versatile, it's so adaptable that it can encompass this huge range of, the kinds of foods people eat in China, which are changing, by the way, all the time. People love food fads and new kinds of foods. And people are embracing things like organic and farm to table and that kind of thing that are big things here. That also changes the way people eat in China. So yeah, those would be some of the general distinctions between Chinese American food served in your average takeout place, which can be really tasty. It's not, doesn't always have to be whatever fancy thing. So I just really encourage people to step away from thinking about authenticity and think more just, do you like it or not? And think about the reasons why this particular food is being served. And it's mostly because of economic survival.
Mhm. And I think there is in food history in general, we see that people want things to be static and unchanging. And that's not what food history is. That's not what the consumption of food is. It's about change as you encounter new ideas, as things develop and grow, as ingredients become available, as new technologies for cooking become available. We see that all the time with 18th century cooking. There is a big difference between things that are happening in the 1750s versus things that are happening in the 1800s, because there's just so much more available and out there and so much more communication. And so I think seeing that in Chinese food as well speaks to this broader story.
Yeah, it's really interesting you mentioned that. I just was hosting a conference on modern Chinese foodways for scholars. And one of the things that people talked about was how the chili pepper, basically so central a taste, the spicy taste of Sichuanese and Hunanese cuisine, is very, very late in Chinese diets, because it only came to China in like the 1600s with the arrival of crops from the New World, right? Like sweet potatoes and maize and a bunch of other things that, but the chili pepper is so central to the idea of Sichuanese cuisine, to think, gee, that's a really pretty late arrival. Chinese cuisine has been dramatically changed by some of these arrivals from, other parts of the world, different ingredients and different tastes and flavors and stuff. So, any Sichuanese person today would be like, of course we have chili peppers, but anyone living in Sichuan in 1500 would not have had chili peppers and would not know what you were talking about. So, the tastes change really dramatically and on our concepts of what that food is. And at the same conference, another participant talked about a food robot that she saw in Shenzhen. Shenzhen is the city right across the border from Hong Kong. So it's very modernized. It's where tons of sneakers exported to the US are made. Tons of other stuff sent to the US is made. And she was visiting a friend in Shenzhen, and they basically have a little robot that you buy a packet, like it's like a Keurig packet where it's like covered with plastic, all the ingredients are inside. You shove it into this machine, and then it cooks the food for you, and then it comes out. I mean, it's total novelty. It's totally, so talk about modern and futuristic. It's like the Jetsons or something like that. And it's just really, really interesting to think about the expanse of Chinese food as both this very ancient tradition in some ways, and then totally modern and totally, like you were saying, the technologies change the way we eat and consume food. And just like here in China, during the pandemic, there's been a huge shift to food delivery, drone delivery, like ordering food, and, not so much going outside, and maybe not so much the traditional way of sharing a plate, family style. So these are, contemporary things dramatically affect how people eat as well. Yeah.
Yeah, history is being made right now, and it'll be interesting to see what happens with that story as we move forward. I think it's strange to know that you're living through history. You're living through a moment that historians are going to sit and we're going to analyze for decades and centuries to come what this moment meant. And I know you've kind of alluded to this a little bit, but so you're in Chapel Hill, I'm here in Charlotte, and we've got people joining us from a lot of different places, and each region, each space in the United States has its own story to tell as a part of this. And this is a loaded question, I know, because it's a complicated question. But what do you see specific to North Carolina when it comes to Chinese food? I mean, I know I want to hear that it's got Southern infusion to it or something like that, but I don't know.
Well, there's a really interesting. I think it's probably on the Southern Foodways Alliance, if I'm not mistaken, website. But we have a wonderful person who was working in our Southern Oral History program here. Sarah, whose last name is escaping me right now, but she was a documentarian for the Southern Foodways Alliance, and she made a little documentary, a short documentary short about this African American Chinese kind of specialty dish that was it was both in Louisiana, in the kind of Delta region there, and then also some in eastern parts of Virginia, and maybe into the Carolinas a little bit. But it was because a lot of Chinese restaurateurs in, earlier decades, or the 30s or 40s, whatever, would open Chinese restaurants to serve African American communities. And these were places where other restaurateurs would not open, white restaurateurs wouldn't open, or didn't want to, or whatever. And so there were certain kinds of dishes that were developed and catered to African American tastes, or, it was called, what was it called, Yak Soba, Yank or Yak, I can't remember what it is, but it's basically a specialized noodle dish that is just noodles, and then you just could put different stuff on top. But it wasn't a dish that you would find at any other kind of Chinese restaurant outside of these African American areas with a lot of African American customers. And it was something that was really special to those people, and that, like, their kids would come and have it when they'd come home, and, it would be a tradition. And unfortunately, a lot of those restaurants are dying out, just because a lot of Chinese restaurateurs, once their kids are grown up, their kids often don't want to go into the restaurant industry. I have had a number of students at UNC whose parents own a Chinese restaurant, who, by gum or by gosh, they're not going to go back to the Chinese restaurant. Uh, they don't want to, because it's like a ton of work. It's a lot of hard labor, and a lot of them never get a vacation and work like practically 365 days a year. And their dream is for their child to get a college education, to not have to work in a Chinese restaurant, with better English and with better opportunities, and, all of these things. So it's really interesting, because I think you will see, or you already are seeing, a proliferation of different kinds of Asian restaurants and different kinds of ethnic restaurants in general, as newer migrants come to the United States and establish themselves, and often have to do so through restaurants, because it's something you can do. So it's interesting, because I think the percentage of Chinese restaurants in the United States will probably decline, just as a result of this natural kind of, um, I don't know what you call it, generational shift in who is owning Chinese restaurants. So yeah, it's just a lot of interesting trends that you can kind of see through the restaurant industry.
Mhm. And I think for so many, even if you're not in the restaurant industry, there's memory that's tied to these experiences. I know we've had a lot of people in the chat that are talking about their memories of going with family to Chinese restaurants, to sitting there, to enjoying the food and the conversation. And I think that's something that just transcends different cultures, different life experiences. We all want to feel that connection. We all want to feel that family, and we all want to feel that kind of that joy that comes from being together. And I think this past year really has shown us just how much we like being together as we've had to be apart. I mean, I know I absolutely adore my family and the like, but it's been very strange this year to not be able to see them, and to kind of experience life through a computer camera, and experience life through takeout rather than being physically in the space. And so it's going to be interesting to see those trends, not only just in experience in restaurants, but also the restaurants themselves. And I know we're coming up on time here, and we've just so enjoyed having this conversation. I always like to give our speakers that kind of last word. It's that moment for, as one of our volunteers says, dazzle us with brilliance. So what do you really hope that people take away from this conversation today? How can people support this community? And what's so important about Chinese food that you really want people to walk away with?
Yeah, I think one of the things is just to say, if you love the food, go eat it. And especially in this time of the pandemic, support any of the restaurants that you really enjoy and care about, because I know it's been a real struggle for a lot of different people. And if you care about the restaurant and you care about the people that work there, then the best thing you can do is support them by going to patronize it. And I was just thinking as you were talking, about the connections we make through food. One of the ways that I keep in touch with my relatives or my parents, we text each other pictures of food that we've made. So, my mom made some vegetarian buns and she sent them to me, or my dad made some special kind of, I can't remember, it was like a pork tenderloin soup or something like that, and my cousin wrapped dumplings. And it's just a way of because we can't, as you said, we couldn't eat together this year, but we still could share our love through food and through our pictures of the food that we made. So I think and I hope that people will um, take those lessons that they've learned this year of being apart in the pandemic and try to carry them forward and share more meals when it's possible with the people that they love, because I can't think of a better way to learn about another culture, or you know travel the world through your kitchen. Basically, I think that's just a wonderful, wonderful idea.
Well, we definitely encourage everyone in the audience today. Charlotte has a ton of amazing, amazing restaurants, and we encourage you to go out, find your favorite. I know I've already got Chinese food ordered for tonight, because I knew if I was going to spend 45 minutes talking about it, I needed needed it tonight. It was going to make me very hungry. So I'm really excited about that. And we just appreciate you taking the time to be a part of this conversation today, for sharing a little bit about the history of Chinese people here in America, the connections across national boundaries, the food, and the stories there. So we just really appreciate you spending 45 minutes with us today. And thank you for being a part of this. And thank you to our audience for coming and joining us along today. We are going to continue with some of our Lunch and Learn programs. We have some limited experiences in person at the museum. We have, hopefully everyone has seen, we got a brand new roof, which we are really excited about. And we're putting in some new exhibits. So we're excited to welcome everyone back. The next big thing on our agenda here at the museum is actually our African American Heritage Festival. So please save the date for that. It's going to be June 7th through June 12th. We've got lots of different experiences exploring a lot of the history, the music, the art, the culture, all of these pieces. And so we cannot wait to welcome everyone back for that. But thank you for being a part of today. We hope everyone has a wonderful day, and please go out and support your local restaurants.
Thanks so much, Lauren.
Thank you.